So the handout that you have there probably won't be, we might make some passing comments about it tonight as we get into our lesson, but it's the rulers over Israel, the nations that ruled over Israel, and then the specific rulers of those nations. I've identified them, so we'll be looking at this list pretty routinely once we get into the intertestament period, which will be next week. Tonight, what we're going to be doing is looking at the biblical prophecy that pertains to this period and the book of Daniel. And so we'll cover that. I've already made the quiz out, and so I made notes to myself in my notes about what I'd be sure to make mention of. So you'll be able to do well on the quiz next week. But the book of Daniel is one of the most fascinating Old Testament prophecies. The language that is used, what I like to refer to as the pinpoint accuracy of Daniel's prophecies. Not only the prophecies that pertain to the intertestament period, but the prophecies that extend into the first century and the Christian age. So we're going to look at those passages in depth later on. But again, we want to make sure that we create the foundation and we understand how we got to where we're going, if you will. And so Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, Habakkuk had prophesied. And I'll give you these passages if you want them, but they won't be on the test, so you don't have to worry about that. But Isaiah 39, verses 6 through 7. Jeremiah 20, verses 4 and 5. Micah chapter 4 and verse 10. Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. These prophets had prophesied that God would punish Judah at the hands of the Babylonians, and some Bibles even use the expressions Chaldeans, which is the same. Chaldeans, Babylonians is the same. 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25, and 2 Chronicles 36 provides the historical record in the history books of the fall of Judah and Jerusalem to the Babylonians. Now, something to keep in mind, because it doesn't always necessarily, sometimes people have a hard time grasping this. There's actually 3 occasions where the Babylonians take Israelites captive and take them to Babylon. It wasn't just one big movement. In 605 BC, Daniel and his 3 friends were carried from Jerusalem to Babylon. So this is the first group who are carried captive to Babylon. And they also took vessels out of the temple and took them to Babylon. And it's this date where we would then really begin the 70-year captivity at this point. And then again in 597 BC, the Babylonians are again in Jerusalem. And this time Nebuchadnezzar is present. Jehoiachin, who is the son of Jehoiakim, is the ruler. He's of the family of David, and he's the ruler on the throne. And again, as you read in the history books and other, you're going to find that he's also known as Jeconiah. I believe that is Jeconiah, Jeconiah. That's Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin. And also you might find the name Coniah, Conriah. He only ruled for 3 months, and Nebuchadnezzar was not happy with him. What you have to remember is that after the 605, Judah has become a vassal or subject to Babylon. They may have a king of David sitting on the throne, but that king is supposed to be following the orders from Babylon. And so Nebuchadnezzar is not happy with the way things have been going. And so on this occasion, they again raid the temple. They take things from the temple and the royal palace, and they make prisoners Jehoiakim, the king, his mother, princes, nobles, skilled artisans, and even the armed guards, garrison, are taken captive to Babylon. The prophet Ezekiel is included in this group that's taken captive. We read about that in Ezekiel chapter 1 and verses 1 through 3. And then 11 years later, and this is the end, 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar again comes up against Jerusalem, and this time he burns the city and destroys the temple that Solomon had built. Zedekiah was the king at this time, and his sons were slain before his eyes, and then they put his eyes out, and he was carried to Babylon. Now, if you listen to what I was saying just a few moments ago, the first group, Daniel and his 3 friends. In this second group, the list of people who were taken, the skilled artisans, the military guard, princes and nobles. The only thing that is left are the poorest people. Babylon was interested in taking the best back to Babylon so that Babylon could prosper. You recall how we talked last week about what the Assyrians did when the Assyrians took the northern kingdom into captivity. Their practice was to take as many of those people, not back to their region, but take them and drop them off into a strange land, in a land that they had conquered somewhere else, and then bring other conquered people and settle them in the land of Samaria, as we come to know it. And that is then where the Samaritans come from, and we'll be talking about them during this intertestament period. But in Jerusalem, only the poorest remained in Judea and Jerusalem. And it wasn't a very nice picture. I mean, things were bad. And they will get worse. But to put this into a perspective again, we know that Assyria had pretty much had control, and we read about Assyria's influence and power, and we can even say that Judah wasn't taken captive by Assyria simply by the grace of God. I mean, there was an occasion when they were about to do it. And we read about the kings of Assyria. And so it was a very, very trying time. But there's a shift in power in that region from Assyria to Babylon. And this occurred about 612 BC. And that's when the wicked city that Jonah had gone to and preached, remember? And then we have another prophet that says, you're not going to get a second chance. And so Nineveh falls, foretold by the prophet Nahum. They had repented at Jonah's preaching, but Nahum was not preaching for them to repent. He was telling them, you're going to be destroyed. And they were. And so the Babylonians then have pretty much free reign in the northern regions above Judea, from Syria across to Babylon. Babylon, just from a geographical position, is in modern-day Iraq. And so if you want to put, look at a modern-day map, you could find Babylon location within the present country of Iraq. There were two great rivers going through there. What were they? The Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, absolutely. And so they've sort of gained all of their control there, but there's a little difficulty south with the Pharaoh Necho in Haran at about 609 BC, when they intended to conquer Egypt, but they weren't successful. They weren't defeated either, but they were definitely slowed down. But eventually, in 605 BC, they defeat the Egyptians. And that's how Babylon rises to the position of conqueror of that part of the world. And Nebuchadnezzar ruled after his father. His father was a man by the name of Nabopolassar. I'll spell that for you if you really want it. I promise you won't see that on test. I won't ask you to spell it correctly, because I'm not even sure I can pronounce it correctly. But it's N-A-B-O. N-A-B-O-P-O-L-A-S-S-A-R. Nabopolassar. And when Nebuchadnezzar takes his position as ruler, he sort of solidifies his power base by marrying the granddaughter of the Median king. Now, we'll learn in later things, particularly when we get into what's called, oftentimes you might read of the Medo-Persian Empire. They're the ones who will eventually conquer the Babylonians. But at this juncture, the Medians are at least in league with the Babylonians. And Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful of the Babylonian rulers. His heirs were not very strong leaders, and within a very short time, the Babylonian Empire will crumble. But under Nebuchadnezzar, per Daniel's prophecy in Daniel 2, there was not a kingdom that would be like it. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But beyond his military victories, Nebuchadnezzar was also known for being a great builder. The most famous of his structures was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. He built this for his queen, but and I don't know the for certain what nationality or heritage this individual was, but he identifies this man by the name Herodotus, Herodutus. He identifies the Hanging Gardens of Babylon as one of the wonders, 7 wonders of the ancient world. I've seen drawings and pictures of what it possibly looked like. And even the city of Babylon itself. I believe that I read somewhere, I don't have it in my notes, but I read somewhere years ago that the city walls, the walls around Babylon, were so wide that 7 chariots could ride abreast across those walls. And so you sort of get the idea that, man, you know, this city is you can't conquer it. But the way they did conquer it was really interesting. Now, if you want to turn your Bibles to Daniel 2, that's where we'll begin our discussion with regards to the intertestament period. So, we know from chapter 1 that Daniel and his friends began to serve the king. And how they became servants of the king is really interesting, isn't it? Because they became servants of the king because they did what God wanted them to do. Remember, I love the old King James Bible says that they refused to eat of the king's dainties. That, you know, they were going to eat kosher food, as we would refer to it today. The food violated the dietary code of the law, and so they had obviously been come into good graces with the guard, and so he said, "Look, let us eat our own stuff." And the guard recognized how presentable they looked and how well and healthy they were. And I'll just throw this in if you ever get a chance. There's a little book out written by a medical doctor, S.I. McMillan. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but he wrote it years ago. It's called None of These Diseases. And he writes about the wisdom of the dietary and as well as just the general laws of diet and hygiene that are presented in the law of Moses. So you might want to get that book if you can find it. I don't even know if it's still in print, but it's S.I. McMillan. None of These Diseases is the title of the book. But Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and this dream really disturbed him. And none of his people could explain the interpretation. And so the king ordered all the wise men of Babylon to be destroyed. Well, Daniel asked the king for some time and is granted, so he and his friends petition God to reveal the dream. And he does. And I love, let's just read what Daniel says. And is it Daniel? Let me see. Daniel 2:20. Yes. Blessed be the God for the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the season. He removes kings and he raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and I praise you, O God of my fathers, for you have given me wisdom and might, and you have made known to me what we ask of you. For you have made known to us the king's demand. So this dream that the king has is of this image. And we're not going to take the time to read it, but I would encourage you to read it, beginning with Well, Daniel explains the dream beginning in 24. He's not really given the explanation because the king wanted him to be able to tell him everything that he had dreamed. And so Daniel uses this opportunity to reveal the God of heaven to the king. This is one of the most remarkable books from the standpoint of a demonstration of God's power and the nature of what the king does and acknowledges God. There's one period where Nebuchadnezzar gets the big head, and he starts thinking about all of this, and he's done it all himself. And literally God makes him go crazy, makes him act like a cow and goes out into the field and eating grass. And what's remarkable about that is go back and look at what Daniel says there in that statement that we just read. He removes kings and he raises kings up. Nebuchadnezzar did not lose his powerful influence while he was out in the field eating grass like a cow. Why? God preserved it. And at the end of that thing, you know what the text says? He raised his eyes to heaven. In essence, his sanity came back to him. We have scenes like that. You remember when the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the fiery furnace. Daniel put in the lion's den. These are all demonstrations of the God of the Israelites being the God of all things. And almost on every one of those occasions, there is an acknowledgement by the rulers that he is indeed God. It's just one of the fascinating things about Daniel that I just love so much. I'm preaching a sermon Sunday on Daniel chapter 9. I don't know if you keep up with it. I don't necessarily keep up with it, but there's been a call for prayer for the nation. They probably won't want to hear my sermon, but my sermon's the prayer that I'm going to be talking about is the prayer of Daniel chapter 9, which is not a praising of the nation, it's an indictment of the nation. And that will be my sermon title Sunday, taken from Daniel 9. But, Daniel just uses every opportunity to reveal God. And that's what we ought to be doing. We live in a time when God needs to be seen for who he is and not what for people think he is. But the dream interpretation is just absolutely phenomenal. And he tells them, 1, you and your kingdom are the head of gold. But there's going to be a kingdom that comes after you. And in essence, all the other kingdoms are inferior. The next kingdom is the chest and arms of silver, an inferior kingdom to yours. The next kingdom is of a belly and thighs of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And the next is interesting because it's a leg of iron and a feet of iron and clay. Strong, fierce, conquering, and yet the clay mingled with the iron and the feet represents what? A fragility. Babylon is the kingdom of gold, the head of gold. The Medo-Persians are the chest and the arms of silver. The Greeks are the belly and thighs of bronze. And Rome is the legs of iron and feet of iron and clay. And I would just say this about the iron and clay thing is really phenomenal. Rome will go through a period where in quick succession after Nero, in essence, the Civil War breaks out. And you have 3 kings or 3 emperors who attempt to get control, but they really don't. You know, one of the things that's going on during this period, Jerusalem is surrounded by the Roman army and are about to be destroyed in 70 A.D. While in the city of Rome, they're in turmoil, civil war. Do you see the clay and the iron thing? They were fragile, but their military held things intact. And in essence, I believe it's Titus, who was the general that was overseeing the siege of Jerusalem. He leaves and goes back to Rome and gets control of things in Rome. But again, we just note the absoluteness of Daniel's prophecies, because he perfectly lays out the succession of emperors that will dominate that part of the world and rule over God's people in Jerusalem and Judea for many, many hundreds of years. But the key, I told some of you earlier, the key of this entire section is verse 44. And in these days, the days of the kings whose legs and feet are iron and iron mixed with clay, in the days of these kings. In the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. And what kingdom was he talking about? The church. He's talking about the church there. Church came into existence sometime around 30, 31, 32. We traditionally say 33, probably not exactly 33, but A.D. Who was ruling the world? Rome. The fourth kingdom. And during the times of those kings, the God of heaven. And I love again how he goes on to say, inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in places the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. It will break in pieces and consume all the others. I don't know how much you've been reading. I've been reading about it just out of interest. But there's somewhat of a phenomena that's taking place in religion in our country today. It's called Christian nationalism. It is as foreign as you get. In fact, I'll tell you this. It is as anti-biblical as you can get. There was a time when there was actually an effort to bring governing power and Christianity together. It became known as the Holy Roman Empire. And it didn't end well. It's just like Christian nationalism will not end well because it is contrary to the Word of God. This says it breaks in pieces worldly kingdoms, empires, governments. God sets governments up and brings them down. He doesn't coexist with one government over any other. And that's an important lesson for us to remember. So the Intertestament period begins the reign of the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. Now, and the beginning of the reign of the Medes and the Persians, we're still reading about them in the book of Daniel. Because when we get over to Daniel chapter 5, we read about Belshazzar. And there's something really important to remember here about Belshazzar. This is the scene where we have the handwriting on the wall. You ever heard that expression? Well, the handwriting's on the wall. It's a foregone conclusion, right? Well, it's in this chapter with Belshazzar. And we because Daniel chapter 5 and verse 1 says, Belshazzar the king. But when Daniel gives him the interpretation of what's about to happen, and you know when it happens? Verse 30 of Daniel 5 says, that very night, Darius the Mede received the kingdom. of Babylon. Actually, when Daniel gave him the explanation, he says, you're going to be number 3 in the kingdom. And why did he say that? Who was number 1 and who was number 2? Well, we go and we study a little bit of the history that we know. Belshazzar's father was Nabonidus, and he was actually the ruler of Babylon at this time. But he gave his responsibilities of administering the things to his son because he was more interested in other things. And so a note that I have here says Nabonidus was the last ruler of Babylon, but he left the administrative duties to his son while he pursued his fascination with ancient religions and was away from Babylon for 10 years. And so because of Daniel 5, biblical critics have oftentimes said Belshazzar is never the king. And so the Bible is wrong. But archaeology has a way of proving, the Bible has always been proven correctly by archaeological discoveries. There's never been an occasion where an archaeological discovery has brought discredit to the Bible. And so archaeological discoveries proved that while Nabonidus was the last ruler, he moved to a place called Tema and left his son in charge. And so that explains the Daniel 5:29 passage where Belshazzar proclaimed Daniel as the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. The first ruler was his father, Nabonidus. The second one was Belshazzar. But that hierarchy didn't last very long because that very night the Medes came in and took over. So again, the intertestament period begins during this time. And if you look back at your sheet that I passed out to you with regard to the rulers over Israel, I do list all of those, including Cyrus. But when we get to the point in history, we'll identify the first one of the intertestament period. But these Persian rulers were ruling over Israel. So in Daniel chapter 7, if you want to turn over there, and again, this is while Belshazzar is still the king or still ruling in Babylon. So let's understand something there. Why in Daniel 5 do we have, or what does this tell us about the book of Daniel? If Daniel 5 has the fall of the Babylonian Empire, and then in Daniel 7 we have a continuation of Belshazzar, what does this tell us? Daniel was not interested and concerned about chronology. He wrote and placed things in his prophecy that were of importance and of pertinence to what he was writing. And so we shouldn't get confused about that. But in Daniel 7, he has a vision of 4 beasts. This vision of Daniel corresponds to the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. But we have a little added on regarding the final beast, which is Rome. In Daniel 8, and I encourage you to read Daniel 7, 8 this week, In Daniel 8, he has a vision of a ram and a goat. This is a prophetic accounting of the period of transition from the Persians to the Greek period, with another interesting little horn in verse 9. But that little horn is not to be confused with the little horn in Daniel 7 and verse 8. These are two separate visions. And then in Daniel 9, 20 through 28, we have the vision of the 70 weeks. And I point that out because this deals with a period of time of probably biblical period. I believe that the book of Hebrews, I'm teaching that on Wednesday nights, the book of Hebrews was probably written, in my opinion, sometime around 60, 66, 60, 68 AD, right before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD. It certainly is a hint that, all of this is coming to an end. But in Daniel 9, 20 through 28, the vision of the 70 weeks deals with the end of the Jewish system that would be realized in AD 70. And then in Daniel 11, and I hope to have a complete outline of Daniel 11 for you. In Daniel 11, we have more detail of that period of transition from Persian to the Greeks and then on to the Roman Empire. It's one of the most fascinating chapters in the book of Daniel. And so what we see here in Daniel, just a quick summary, is in the first vision of or in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, we know that when it comes to that third kingdom or the second kingdom of the Medo-Persians, that at some point in that period is when the Intertestament begins. And then the rest of that dream and Daniel's interpretation, up until we get to the Roman Empire, and particularly with regards to the stone that breaks into pieces all of those kingdoms, which is speaking of the church. We get into the New Testament period. And then Daniel's dream of Daniel chapter 7, his vision there. And then Daniel 8 and Daniel 9. All of these pertain to this period that we refer to as the Intertestament. Or some have referred to it as the 400 years of silence, because God does not speak by prophecy or to any prophet between the close of Malachi and the beginning of the New Testament period with John the Baptizer. Has anybody got any questions? Anybody got any comments? Feel free. Huh? It's just unbelievable. It is. And the thing is that Daniel is writing the history in prophecy. Did I tell you when I talk about Daniel and prophecy, I like to use the expression pinpoint accuracy. And that's exactly what it is. I mean, Daniel is just right on target. And that's why the liberal theologians and Bible skeptics don't like Daniel. Because, boy, I mean, it really tears them up. And so years and years ago, they tried to make a case for its writings having been done well past the period of Daniel. But then in 1946, there was a major discovery in and around the region of the Dead Sea where they found some scrolls. You've heard them called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it really put Daniel clearly back into the time frame that he actually wrote it. And by the way, the writers of those Dead Sea Scrolls were a group known as the Essenes. And the Essenes come into existence during that intertestament period. So we'll be talking about them as well. I was really short last week, and I've gone over a few minutes tonight. I'm sorry about that. Huh? Get to what? I give it to my good brother. Who I was telling them about a preacher, an old preacher, and I can't remember what his name was, but when I was in school, he came and spoke one day in chapel, and he said, boy, they introduced us to homiletics, and I got sick, and then they gave us hermeneutics, and I like to die out of it. So, there you go.